This is the video that's going to be reading out the sources for question C. What were the experiences of free settlers, or how did the lives of free settlers change once they arrived in Australia? Our very first source here is a notice of ticket to leave men. A ticket to leave man was someone who used to be a convict, but will now be a free person. I don't know if that Netflix ad just popped up on the side of the screen for you guys, but it did for me. Anyway, this is what the context of the source is. Notice offering a conditional pardon to ticket or leave men who will serve in the police force. Convicts could gain a license for good behavior, known as ticket of leave, which allowed them to receive wages for their work, live independently, and move freely about the colony. This license could be withdrawn for bad behavior. The government kept skilled convicts for work on government projects, but did allow them to work for the settlers at certain times. Let's go on to source B. So source B down here, it's from a man named Worgan, who was one of the first settlers in Australia in 1788. Not a convict. He was probably an officer. You might have to do a little bit of research to find out who he is. But this is what he says, his experience in Australia. The thunder and lightning are astonishingly awful here, and by the heavy gloom that hangs over the woods at that time, these elements are in commotion, and from the nature and violence done to many trees, we have reason to apprehend that much mischief can be done by lightning here. He's describing his experience of the Australian landscape. In Australia, some words you may have to unpack there to understand in more detail. But let's move on to source C. I wonder if I can change that. Nope. Source C says, it's a letter from a man named Ross to another man named Stevens. So Ross is one of the people in Australia. Stevens is a lord back in England. You have to do some research to find out who these guys are. This is what they say. Might I presume to intrude an opinion on their lordships with respect to the utility of settlement upon this coast, at least upon this part of it? It should be that it never can be made to answer the intended purpose or wish of government. For the country seems totally destitute of everything that can be an object of a commercial nation, a very fine harbour excepted, and I must fear that the nature of the soil is such as will not be brought to yield more than sufficient sustenance for the needy immigrants, whose desperate fortunes may induce them to try the experiment. Here I beg leave to observe to their lordships that the above is but a private opinion. So it's Ross giving his private opinion about what he thinks of the Australian landscape. The next source we have is source D. At present, no country can afford less support to the first settlers, or to be disadvantageously placed for receiving support from the mother country, on which it must for a time depend. It will require patience and perseverance, neither of which will, I hope, be wanting. And this is written from Arthur Phillip, who is the first governor of Australia, the man who's in charge of this colony. And he's talking to Nepean, who's one of the lords back in England. You may have to double check this, but he may at this time have been the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And he's writing back, explaining the situation that the colony is in. So some words that you may have to investigate there to understand what he's trying to say. But he's describing the condition of New South Wales. Our next source is source E, and this is George Purdue Harris's cottage at Sandy Bay in 1806. So this is a artwork showing what it was like to live in Australia in 1806. Have a think about how this may be helpful for you. The next source, source F, is from a letter written by James Hentley, and it's quoted in R. Broom, The Colonial Experience, 2009. So it's a primary source that then has been republished in a book by a man named R. Broom in The Colonial Experience. I have almost come to the conclusion that New South Wales will do more for our family than England ever will. What can we do with £10,000 among all of us? Remember, pounds are their currency. It would be idle to suppose we can live many years longer or less than £200 a year, unless indeed we choose to descend many steps in the scale of society, having at the same time an opportunity of doing as well and perhaps better in New South Wales, under British Dominion and a fine climate. Immediately we get there, we shall be placed in the first rank of society, a circumstance which must not be overlooked. Something that's important to understand about England in this time period is they've got a very strict social class system, where if you are rich and you're posh, you will have more opportunities than someone who is poor, destitute, living on the streets. I think that's the same for most societies, but England is particularly pronounced. So this man here, James Hentley, is saying, if I move to Australia, I can go from being a lower class person to then moving to Australia my apologies for that. You can move to Australia and you become the first rank of person in Australia. This here is a really interesting source, Source G. It was a little cartoon that was published. It's called Here and There, or Immigration, a Remedy. So it's showing what your life will be like if you stay in England versus what your life would be like if you moved to Australia. It was published in 1848, so a while after the First Fleet had left. And it's a cartoon published in an English magazine called Punch. Consider, what was the motive of this source? What are they trying to do? Who is their audience? Who are they targeting? You might have to do a little bit more of a research in this, the origin of this source, the author. Who is Punch? What are they trying to achieve? A very last source down the bottom of the page there, Source H. It's written by Elizabeth MacArthur, who was the wife of John MacArthur, the first man in Australia, first kind of really rich man in Australia. He had lots of sheep. And in Australia, if you've got lots of sheep, you're rich. This is what she says. Everything was new to me. Every bird, every insect, flower, etc. In short, all was novelty around me, and was noticed with a degree of eager curiosity and perturbation that after a while subsided into calmness. So some interesting words there. We're going back 250 years, so they're not going to speak the same as us. They put some very interesting words in to show off their education. So you might have to look up some of them. But this is Elizabeth MacArthur's experience upon arriving in Australia.